Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. We set out from Moab well after sunset on that October evening in 2022, the three of us, Derek, Brett, and me, bound for the dense, shadow-choked valleys of Monte La Salle National Forest. The air carried the sharp bite of autumn, and our breath formed small clouds in the frigid night air. At 28, I'd been hunting these woods for over a decade, and normally the familiar weight of my rifle and the excited panting of our dogs would fill me with confidence. Tonight felt different from the moment we parked the truck. Derek, my longtime hunting partner, checked his gear with unusual meticulousness, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he loaded ammunition. Brett, the youngest of our group at 25, kept glancing nervously at the tree line, his usual cocky demeanor replaced by something I'd never seen in him before, genuine unease. "Weather's supposed to hold," Derek muttered, though dark clouds were already gathering overhead, threatening to block what little moonlight we'd have. "Should be perfect for tracking." Rex, my chocolate retriever, whined softly at my feet, his ears flat against his skull. In all our years together, I'd never seen him behave this way before a hunt. The other two dogs, Derek's beagle Mason and Brett's pointer Duke, huddled close together, their usual eager energy replaced by nervous pacing. We'd hunted coyotes in these woods countless times, knew every trail and clearing within a 10-mile radius. The routine was simple. Track the pack, set up in a good position, use the calls to draw them in. We'd done it so many times we could navigate these woods blindfolded. But as we shouldered our packs and checked our headlamps, something in the air itself seemed wrong, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Dogs seem spooked?" Brett observed, his voice lacking its usual bravado. Duke refused to move away from his leg, pressing close like a frightened child. "They'll be fine once we get moving," I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. But Rex's behavior was troubling me. He was a seasoned hunting dog, trained to ignore distractions and focus on the task at hand. Tonight, he acted like he wanted nothing more than to retreat to the safety of the truck. We entered the forest just after midnight, our headlamps cutting narrow beams through the thick canopy above. The familiar crunch of leaves beneath our boots should have been comforting, but instead it seemed abnormally loud, as if the forest was listening to our every step. Derek took point, consulting his GPS occasionally, while Brett and I followed with the dogs between us. "Remember that pack we tracked last month?" Derek asked, his voice artificially cheerful. "Found them about 3 miles in, near that old logging road." "Yeah," I replied, but my mind was elsewhere, focused on the oppressive feeling that seemed to press down on us from all sides. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and our breath came in thicker clouds now, creating small halos around our light beams. 20 minutes into our hike, the first thing that struck me was the absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but something far more disturbing. A complete absence of sound that felt unnatural, oppressive. Usually these woods hummed with life. The distant howl of coyotes, the haunting call of owls, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Tonight, nothing stirred. The silence was so complete it seemed to have physical weight, pressing against my eardrums until they ached. Even our own breathing sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself taking shallower breaths to minimize the noise. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Derek whispered, his voice barely audible but seeming to echo strangely in the still air. Brett nodded, swinging his headlamp beam nervously between the darkened tree trunks. "It's like everything just vanished." I'd experienced quiet forests before, especially during harsh weather when animals sought shelter. But this was different. This felt deliberate, as if every living creature had fled from something, leaving us alone in a void. The dogs sensed it too, their usual excited exploration replaced by cautious, almost reluctant steps. Rex kept looking back toward the truck, his body language screaming that he wanted to return to safety. Mason and Duke weren't much better, staying close to our legs instead of ranging ahead as they normally would. Their noses worked constantly, testing the air, but whatever they smelled seemed to frighten rather than excite them. Maybe there's a storm coming, Brett suggested, though the sky above showed only scattered clouds. Animals can sense weather changes before we can. Derek stopped abruptly, holding up his hand for silence. We froze, straining our ears for any sound. The quiet stretched on, broken only by the distant creak of tree branches and our own heartbeats. Then, just as we were about to move on, something else reached us. A sound so faint I almost missed it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my grip tightening on my rifle. Derek nodded slowly, his face pale in the glow of his headlamp. "Something's out there." We stood motionless for several minutes, listening intently, but the breathing sound didn't repeat. Whatever had made it was either gone or had learned to be more careful. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. Brett cleared his throat softly. "Could be another hunter." "At this hour?" Derek shook his head. "And why would they be trying to hide from us?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered and increasingly troubling. We'd all heard stories of people getting lost in these woods, of search parties finding only empty campsites and abandoned gear. Most of those stories had rational explanations: exposure, falls, simple disorientation. But standing there in that unnatural silence, surrounded by darkness that seemed to swallow our light, I began to understand how easy it would be to simply disappear. We pressed deeper into the forest, our formation tighter now, nobody wanting to stray far from the group. The terrain grew rougher, forcing us to navigate around fallen logs and dense patches of undergrowth. Our headlamps created a small bubble of visibility, but beyond that thin shell of light lay an impenetrable wall of darkness that could hide anything. I followed the trail with my light, finding more prints that told the same impossible story. Whatever had made these tracks moved in a pattern unlike anything I'd ever encountered, sometimes on all fours like a typical quadruped, then suddenly shifting to what appeared to be bipedal locomotion, only to drop back down again. The spacing was wrong too. The stride length varied dramatically, sometimes short and quick like a nervous animal, other times covering ground in long, almost human-like steps. In several places, the prints were so deep they suggested something much heavier than a coyote, yet in others they were barely visible, as if the creature had somehow become weightless. "Look at this one." Derek pointed to a particularly clear print. The impression showed 5 distinct digit marks, but they were too long to be human, ending in what were unmistakably claws. Yet the overall shape of the foot was disturbingly human-like, complete with what appeared to be an arch and heel. Rex whined softly and backed away from the tracks, his hackles rising. The other dogs were equally disturbed, refusing to approach the strange prints despite our encouragement. Their behavior was the most unsettling part. These were experienced hunting dogs, trained to track various animals, yet they reacted to these prints like nothing they'd ever encountered. "How fresh are they?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Derek examined the edges of the prints, testing the firmness of the mud. "Recent. Very recent. The stream's been running steady, so these would wash away pretty quickly. I'd say within the last hour or two." The implication hung heavy between us. Whatever had made these tracks had passed this way recently, possibly even while we'd been hiking toward this spot. The creature could still be nearby, watching us from the darkness beyond our lights. Brett stood up abruptly, swinging his rifle in a slow arc as he scanned the surrounding woods. "We should go back." "No," Derek said firmly, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "We came here to hunt. These could be from some kind of injured animal moving strangely because it's hurt." I wanted to agree with him, to find a rational explanation for what we were seeing. But deep down, I knew these weren't the tracks of any injured coyote. They represented something else entirely, something that defied easy categorization. The way they shifted between human and animal characteristics suggested a level of anatomical impossibility that made my mind reel. "Let's follow them," I heard myself say, surprising everyone, including myself. "At least for a little way. See where they lead." Derek nodded reluctantly, and we began tracking the strange prints deeper into the forest. Behind us, the dogs followed with obvious reluctance, their body language screaming warnings we chose to ignore. The tracks led us along a winding path that seemed to follow no logical route. Instead of taking the easiest passage through the forest, they meandered in seemingly random directions, sometimes doubling back on themselves, other times leading us through particularly dense patches of undergrowth that tore at our clothing and gear. What disturbed me most was how the prints seemed to anticipate the terrain. In areas where a normal animal would struggle or seek an alternate route, these tracks showed the creature navigating with an intelligence that suggested advanced planning. It avoided obvious obstacles while taking advantage of natural cover, moving with a purpose that felt uncomfortably strategic. "It's like it knew we'd follow," Brett muttered, voicing the thought that had been growing in my mind. Derek paused to examine a particularly unusual set of prints. "Look at this. See how they're spaced? It's like whatever made them was playing, leaving us a trail to follow." The prints here showed clear signs of deliberate placement. Instead of the natural gait pattern we'd been following, these were positioned almost artistically, creating a clear path that would be impossible to miss. Worse, they seemed to be leading us away from any familiar landmarks, deeper into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his body going rigid. His nose worked frantically, testing the air, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. The other dogs immediately picked up on his distress, clustering together and refusing to move forward. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, kneeling beside Rex and following his gaze into the darkness ahead. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then something moved, just at the edge of my light's reach. A dark shape that seemed to flow between the tree trunks with unnatural fluidity. It was there and gone so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd actually seen anything at all. "Did you see that?" Derek's voice was tight with tension. "Something's out there," Brett confirmed, raising his rifle. "About 50 yards ahead, moving parallel to us." We stood frozen, our lights sweeping the forest ahead, but whatever we'd glimpsed had vanished completely. The silence pressed in around us again, somehow even more oppressive than before. I realized I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, along with the rapid breathing of my companions. Then, from somewhere in the darkness ahead, came a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It started as a low rumble, almost subsonic, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. Gradually, it rose in pitch, becoming a howl that was both familiar and completely wrong. It sounded like a coyote's call, but distorted, stretched into something that conveyed not just wildness, but a kind of malevolent intelligence. The howl seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing strangely through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "That's not natural," Derek whispered, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. The howl faded, replaced by something even worse. Silence that felt expectant, as if the forest itself was waiting for our response. Rex pressed against my leg, trembling despite his training and experience. The other dogs were equally terrified, their usual hunting instincts completely overwhelmed by whatever primal fear this creature inspired. I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. We keep following the tracks, but we stay together, no matter what. Looking back, I realize how foolish that decision was. We should have retreated immediately, should have trusted the dog's instincts over our own stubborn curiosity. But in that moment, faced with something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world, retreat felt like cowardice. The tracks continued ahead, leading us deeper into unfamiliar territory. With each step, I felt like we were being drawn into a trap, but I couldn't shake the compulsion to see where the trail would lead. Behind us, our footprints in the soft earth created our own trail, one that something else might soon be following. What happened next unfolded so quickly that my memory of it remains fragmented, like trying to recall a nightmare. One moment we were following the tracks in formation, our lights cutting through the darkness, and the next we were running blind through the forest, separated and terrified. It started with the dogs. Rex suddenly lunged sideways, barking frantically, his leash jerking from my grasp. Mason and Duke followed immediately, their leads tangling as they bolted in different directions. In the confusion of trying to catch them, our formation broke apart. "Rex!" I called, plunging after my dog as he disappeared into a thick stand of pine trees. Behind me, I could hear Derek and Brett shouting for their own animals, their voices already growing distant. I should have stopped, should have regrouped with the others before pursuing the dogs. But Rex was crashing through the underbrush ahead of me, his panicked barking echoing strangely in the dense forest, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing him to whatever had terrified him so badly. Branches clawed at my face and snagged my clothing as I pushed through the undergrowth, following the sound of Rex's distress calls. My headlamp beam swung wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made navigation nearly impossible. Tree trunks loomed out of the darkness like sentinels, and more than once I barely avoided running headfirst into low-hanging branches. "Derek, Brett!" I called out, hoping to re-establish contact with my hunting partners. But my voice seemed swallowed by the forest, producing no response except a faint echo that sounded wrong somehow, as if it were being thrown back at me by something that wasn't quite an echo. Rex's barking stopped abruptly, replaced by a whimpering that sent ice through my veins. I fought my way through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth and found him huddled at the base of a massive pine tree, trembling and refusing to move despite my urgent calls. "Come on, boy," I whispered, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Let's find the others and get out of here." But as I knelt to gather Rex into my arms, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere behind me, close enough to be clearly audible, came Derek's voice. "Over here," he called. "I found something." I turned toward the sound, relief flooding through me. But Rex whimpered more urgently and pressed himself harder against the tree, refusing to move toward Derek's voice. His behavior struck me as odd. Rex knew Derek well and had never shown any fear of him. "Derek?" I called back. "Where are you?" "Right here," came the reply, but something about it bothered me. The voice was Derek's, but the inflection was slightly off, as if someone was trying to imitate him without quite getting the cadence right. Rex's reaction confirmed my growing unease. Dogs have senses far superior to ours, and Rex was clearly terrified of whatever was calling to me in Derek's voice. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I ignored the calls and focused on calming my dog. The false Derek continued calling for several minutes, the voice growing more insistent and frustrated. Gradually, the calls began to change, becoming less recognizably human and more something else. The final call dissolved into a sound that was part growl, part scream, and part something I couldn't identify. Then silence returned, more oppressive than ever. I sat with Rex at the base of that pine tree, both of us trembling, trying to process what we'd just experienced. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it had learned to mimic human voices with disturbing accuracy. The implications were terrifying. Minutes passed before I worked up the courage to move. When I finally did, It was with the grim realization that I was alone in an unfamiliar part of the forest, with something hunting me that was far more dangerous than any coyote. Moving through the forest with Rex pressed close to my side, I tried to maintain some sense of direction, but the darkness made navigation nearly impossible. Every tree looked identical in the narrow beam of my headlamp, and I'd lost all sense of the path we'd been following. The tracks that had led us here seemed to have vanished entirely, as if they'd never existed. Then I heard Brett's voice, calling from somewhere to my left. "Hey, over here! I found a way out!" Rex's immediate reaction told me everything I needed to know. Instead of perking up at the familiar voice, he cowered against my leg, whimpering softly. After what had happened with the false Derek, I wasn't about to be fooled again. "Brett?" I called back cautiously. "What's your location?" "About 100 yards west of where we got separated," came the reply. "I can see the truck from here." The voice was perfect. Brett's usual confident tone, his slight regional accent, even the way he tended to project his voice when excited. But Rex's terrified reaction told a different story, and I'd learned to trust my dog's instincts over my own desperate hope for rescue. I remained silent, hoping whatever was calling would give up and move on. Instead, the voice became more insistent. "Come on, man. I know you can hear me. Derek's already here. We've been looking for you." The mention of Derek sent a chill down my spine. If this thing had somehow gotten to Derek, if it was capable of... I didn't want to finish that thought. Instead, I focused on moving quietly through the forest, trying to put distance between myself and whatever was using my friend's voice to hunt me. But the voice followed, always staying just out of sight but close enough to be clearly audible. Worse, it began to demonstrate an intimate knowledge of our hunting trips, referencing specific incidents and inside jokes that only the real Brett would know. "Remember that time you missed that buck at 30 yards? The false Brett called, chuckling in exactly Brett's manner. "Derek still gives you grief about that shot." The accuracy of the memory was disturbing. Either this thing had been watching us for longer than I cared to imagine, or it had access to Brett's memories in some way I didn't want to contemplate. Rex continued to tremble against my leg, his fear so intense I could feel it radiating through his body. The calls continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes Brett's voice, sometimes Derek's. Occasionally both in what seemed like a conversation between my missing friends. They discussed our hunting plans, shared memories from previous trips, even argued in the same way Derek and Brett sometimes did. But underneath the familiar voices was something else. A subtle wrongness that became more apparent the longer I listened. The inflections were slightly off, like an actor who'd studied the role but hadn't quite mastered it. Occasionally, words would be drawn out too long or cut off too abruptly. Most disturbing of all, the voices sometimes overlapped in ways that suggested they were coming from the same source. Whatever was out there was capable of producing multiple voices simultaneously. "We know you're scared," Derek's voice said, taking on a gentler tone. "But you need to come out. There's something in these woods, something dangerous. We need to stick together." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on me. There was indeed something dangerous in these woods, and it was the thing speaking to me in my friends' voices. But the psychological manipulation was clever, appealing to my fear and my loyalty to my hunting partners, trying to convince me that my own safety depended on trusting the very thing that threatened me. Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked. From somewhere far ahead, barely audible over the false voices, came a sound that made my heart leap with hope. Real barking, the familiar voices of Mason and Duke. If the dogs were still alive and together, there was a chance Derek and Brett were as well. I made another crucial decision. Ignoring the increasingly frantic calls behind me, I headed toward the sound of the real dogs, Rex trotting alongside me with the first sign of hope he'd shown all night. Following the distant barking, I pushed through increasingly dense forest, Rex staying close to my side. The false voices behind us gradually faded, replaced by an ominous silence that felt like a held breath. Whatever was mimicking my friends seemed to have given up on vocal deception and was now pursuing a different strategy. I could feel it following us, staying just beyond the reach of my headlamp, matching our pace through the dark forest. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow that seemed too fluid, too quick to be entirely natural. But whenever I turned my light toward these movements, nothing was there except trees and darkness. Rex's behavior confirmed that we weren't alone. His head swiveled constantly, tracking something I couldn't see. His body tense with the awareness of being hunted. Several times he stopped abruptly, growling low in his throat at some threat I couldn't detect, forcing me to wait until he was ready to move again. The barking ahead grew louder, more frantic, and I recognized the distinct voices of Mason and Duke. They sounded terrified but alive, which gave me hope that Derek and Brett might still be unharmed. But as I pushed through a thick stand of pine trees, what I found made my blood run cold. Derek and Brett were there, standing with their backs to me in a small clearing, their dogs circling them frantically. But something was wrong with the scene. They stood too still, too perfectly motionless, like mannequins positioned for display. Their headlamps were dark, leaving them as silhouettes against the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Derek, Brett?" I called softly, but neither responded. Rex refused to enter the clearing, digging his claws into the earth and pulling backward with all his strength. His distress was so intense that he began whimpering, a sound I'd never heard from him before. The other dogs continued their frantic circling, but they too avoided getting too close to the two figures. I raised my rifle, switching on the weapon-mounted flashlight that provided a much stronger beam than my headlamp. What I saw in that harsh white light nearly broke my sanity. The figures weren't Derek and Brett. They had the right height and build, wore identical clothing, even had the same equipment and gear. But their proportions were subtly wrong. Limbs slightly too long, heads positioned at angles that no human neck could achieve. Most horrifying of all, they had no faces, just smooth expanses of flesh where features should have been. As my light hit them, both figures began to turn toward me with movements that were mechanical, jerky, like marionettes operated by an unskilled puppeteer. The turning motion was wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. Too much rotation, bones bending in directions that defied anatomy. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Rex, who was now openly terrified and trying to flee back into the forest. But as I retreated, the figures began to change, their featureless faces developing familiar characteristics. Derek's weathered features emerged on one, Brett's younger face on the other, both wearing expressions of desperate relief. "Thank God you found us," Derek's imposter said, the voice perfectly matching my friend's tone. "We've been lost for hours." But the mouth movements were wrong, out of sync with the words, like a badly dubbed movie. Worse, I realized that the real Derek and Brett were nowhere to be seen. These things had either replaced them or... I couldn't bring myself to consider the alternative. "Where are Derek and Brett?" I demanded, keeping my rifle trained on the false figures. "The real ones?" The imposters exchanged a glance that was disturbingly human in its calculation. Then Derek's double smiled, an expression that was anatomically correct but completely devoid of warmth or humanity. "We are Derek and Brett," it said. "You're confused, probably suffering from exposure and exhaustion. Let us help you get back to the truck." The thing began walking toward me, moving with Derek's characteristic gait but somehow wrong in every detail. Its feet didn't quite touch the ground properly, and its arms swung with mechanical precision rather than natural rhythm. I backed away, keeping my weapon aimed at center mass, but the creature continued approaching with apparent unconcern for the rifle pointed at it. Rex was now pulling desperately at his leash, trying to drag me away from the clearing, his panic infectious and escalating my own fear to near breaking point. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice cracked with terror. The derrick thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. "You're not thinking clearly. Put the gun down and let us help you." That's when I made the decision that would haunt my dreams for years to come. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot echoed through the forest like thunder, momentarily deafening in the confined space. The derrick thing staggered backward, a dark stain spreading across its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the wound with what appeared to be curiosity rather than pain. "That wasn't very friendly," it said, its voice maintaining Derek's exact cadence despite the grievous injury. Brett's imposter hadn't even flinched at the gunshot. Instead, it began moving toward me from a different angle, forcing me to divide my attention between two threats. Worse, the wound on the derrick thing was already beginning to close, the dark stain on its shirt fading as if the injury had never existed. I fired again, this time at Brett's double, watching in horror as the bullet struck but produced only a momentary stagger. Both creatures continued their approach, their movements becoming less human and more predatory with each step. Rex made the decision for me. Breaking free from his leash with desperate strength, he bolted toward the tree line. I followed without hesitation, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic, branches tearing at my clothing and gear. Behind me, I could hear the creatures pursuing, but they no longer bothered with human speech. The sounds they made were a horrible mixture of growls, clicks, and something that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so utterly inhuman. They moved through the forest with impossible speed, crashing through obstacles that should have slowed them down. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, my lungs burning and my heart hammering against my ribs. Rex stayed ahead of me, his superior night vision and knowledge of the terrain our only advantages. Several times I stumbled and nearly fell, but terror kept me moving when exhaustion should have dropped me. The pursuit seemed to last forever, but gradually I became aware that the sounds behind me were fading. Whatever those things were, they either couldn't maintain their inhuman speed indefinitely, or had decided to abandon the chase for some other reason. I didn't slow down to find out which. Rex led me through terrain I didn't recognize, but his instincts proved true. After what felt like hours of desperate flight, I saw the blessed gleam of headlights through the trees. The truck sat exactly where we'd left it, untouched and ordinary, a bastion of normalcy in a night that had become a waking nightmare. I fumbled with shaking hands to unlock the vehicle, Rex leaping into the passenger seat the moment the door opened. I started the engine and reversed out of the parking area without even bothering to secure my gear properly, desperate to put distance between us and whatever still lurked in those dark woods. Only when we were back on the main highway, surrounded by the comforting lights of civilization, did I allow myself to truly consider what had happened. Derek and Brett were gone, possibly dead. Definitely not the creatures that had mimicked their appearances. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation, but the memories of those featureless faces developing familiar features would haunt me forever. I never reported what happened that night. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I told authorities that we'd become separated in the dark forest and that I'd lost track of my friends. Search parties found no trace of Derek or Brett, no evidence of their fate, no clues about what might have happened to them. The official conclusion was that they'd become lost and succumbed to exposure, their bodies claimed by the vast wilderness of Manti La Salle National Forest. I attended their memorial services, listened to friends and family share memories of two good men, and never spoke about what I'd really seen that night. But I know the truth. Something lives in those woods. Something that can learn human faces and voices. Something that hunts with intelligence and malice. I've never returned to hunt in Manti La Salle, and I never will. Some places are meant to remain wild, untouched by human presence. Rex never fully recovered from that night either. The confident hunting dog I'd known was replaced by a nervous animal that refused to enter any forest, day or night. He lived out his remaining years as a house pet, content to stay close to home and safety. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my windows, I think I can hear familiar voices calling my name from the darkness. Derek's voice, Brett's voice, pleading with me to come outside, to come back to the forest where they're waiting for me. But I know better now. I know that some invitations should never be accepted, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The forest keeps its secrets, and I intend to keep mine. God help anyone else who might venture into those woods after dark, following strange tracks and trusting voices that sound like friends. The forest is patient, and it's always hungry for new faces to learn, new voices to steal. I pray they'll be smarter than we were that October night in 2022, when 3 hunters entered Monte La Salle National Forest, and only one came out. This happened when I was in middle school, back in 2009. I was about 12 years old, living in a small town on the outskirts of Seattle where nothing extraordinary ever happened. My days consisted of homework, video games, and occasionally riding bikes with neighborhood friends, until that weekend in late October that changed everything. The invitation came on a Tuesday during lunch period. My friend Grace, a girl with wild curly hair and an adventurous spirit who had moved to our town just 6 months prior, slid a handmade card across the cafeteria table. The paper was adorned with glitter and cartoon forest animals. "My parents are letting me have a camping birthday party this weekend," she announced proudly. "They rented a cabin by Evergreen Lake. You have to come." I opened the card, finding details written in her characteristically messy handwriting. The camping ground was nestled deep in the Olympic Peninsula, a 3-hour drive from civilization. The thought of being so isolated made me hesitate. "It's going to be amazing," Grace continued, noticing my uncertainty. "My uncle works as a ranger there. He says there's a lake perfect for swimming, trails for hiking, and the stars are incredible at night." I nodded, trying to seem enthusiastic. Truth was, I'd never been camping before. My parents were the indoor type, preferring air conditioning and room service to tents and campfires. But Grace had been nothing but kind to me since arriving at our school, and I didn't want to disappoint her. "Who else is coming?" I asked. "Hannah, Darius, and Jin from our class. My cousin Tamara, too," she replied. That night, I convinced my parents it would be educational, a chance to learn about nature and survival skills. What I didn't tell them was how an inexplicable feeling of dread had settled in my stomach when I thought about those deep, dark woods. Friday afternoon came quickly. My mom dropped me off at Grace's house where her father, a tall, bearded man with kind eyes, was loading camping supplies into their SUV. Hannah and Jin were already there, excited and chattering about ghost stories they planned to tell around the campfire. "You brought a flashlight, right?" Jin asked me, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Grace's cousin says the cabin doesn't have great lighting." I patted my backpack. 2, and extra batteries." The drive took longer than expected. What started as suburbs gave way to increasingly remote landscapes. Cell phone service disappeared about 90 minutes in, and the radio stations faded to static not long after. Grace's father kept us entertained with stories from his own childhood camping trips, but I couldn't help noticing how the forests grew denser and darker as we traveled. Darius and Tamara were meeting us there directly. As we turned onto an unmarked gravel road, the SUV bumped and jostled us. Through the windows, I watched the sunlight fracture through pine branches, creating unsettling patterns that moved across my lap like spectral fingers. "Almost there," Grace's father announced as we passed a weathered wooden sign reading Evergreen Lake Campgrounds, Esther 1953. The road ended at a small clearing where another car was parked. Darius waved from a picnic table, Tamara beside him looking bored. Beyond them stood our cabin, smaller and more dilapidated than I had imagined. Its wooden exterior was gray with age, the windows small and dark like vacant eyes. Behind it, Barely visible through the trees, I caught the silver gleam of water. Evergreen Lake. "Don't look so worried," Grace whispered, nudging my shoulder. "It's better inside. And wait until you see the stars tonight." I forced a smile, but couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching us. The cabin's interior smelled of dust and pine. 2 small bedrooms with bunk beds flanked a central living area with a wood stove, a worn couch, and a table with mismatched chairs. A crude kitchenette occupied one corner, complete with a propane stove and an ancient refrigerator that hummed ominously. "Home, sweet home," Grace announced, claiming a top bunk by tossing her sleeping bag onto it. Grace's father stored our food in metal containers. "To keep the animals out," he explained, and helped us gather firewood before preparing to leave. "Uncle Roy will check on you kids tomorrow morning," he told Grace, handing her a 2-way radio. "Channel 3 if you need anything. The ranger station is just 2 miles down the road." The adult's departure left a strange silence. We stood awkwardly in the cabin until Tamara, older than us at 15, took charge. "Let's explore before it gets dark," she suggested. "I want to see this amazing lake Grace keeps talking about." The path to the lake was overgrown but visible, winding through trees that seemed to lean inward as we passed. I noticed claw marks on some trunks. Bear activity, I assumed, recalling the safety videos we'd watched in science class. The thought made my throat tighten. Evergreen Lake emerged suddenly through the trees. Despite my unease, I had to admit it was beautiful. A perfect oval of dark water surrounded by towering pines, its surface reflecting the cloud-streaked sky. A small wooden dock extended about 20 feet into the water. "Last one in is a rotten egg," Darius shouted, kicking off his shoes. Jin followed immediately, both boys cannonballing into the water with excited yells. I hesitated, noticing how the water swallowed their bodies, how dark it looked below the surface. Something about the stillness of the farther shore disturbed me. The way the trees there seemed denser, the shadows deeper. "You coming?" Hannah asked, already wading in. "Maybe later," I said. "I'll watch the backpacks." From my position on the dock, I studied our surroundings, trying to dismiss my growing anxiety. That's when I first noticed it. A strange silence. The forest sounds, birds, insects, wind in the branches, had completely ceased. As dusk approached, we returned to the cabin to prepare Grace's birthday celebration. Tamara had brought battery-powered lanterns that cast long shadows across the walls. Jin and Darius gathered stones to build a fire pit outside, while Hannah and I helped Grace arrange her birthday cupcakes on a plastic plate. "Sorry it's not a proper cake," Hannah said. Grace smiled. "Are you kidding? Camping cupcakes are the best." The fire crackled warmly, pushing back the darkness that had settled among the trees. We sang "Happy Birthday," our voices sounding small against the vast wilderness surrounding us. After eating, we roasted marshmallows and told stories. "My dad says these forests have the highest rate of disappearances in the state," Darius claimed, his face eerily lit from below by his flashlight. Tamara rolled her eyes. "That's just to scare tourists away from his hunting spots." "No, it's true," Darius insisted. "People go hiking and never come back. They find their cameras sometimes with the last photos just showing trees, normal forest stuff. Nothing scary in the pictures, but the people, gone." Jin shuddered visibly. "Can we talk about something else?" We shifted to school gossip and video games, but I found my attention repeatedly drawn to the edge of our light's reach, where the forest waited in absolute blackness. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement, just a quick displacement of shadow, but convinced myself it was the fire's flickering light playing tricks. After the cupcakes and stories, Grace suggested we walk back to the lake to stargaze. The idea of returning to the water in darkness made my stomach clench, but everyone else agreed enthusiastically. Tamara led our procession, swinging her powerful flashlight in wide arcs that briefly illuminated twisted tree trunks and undergrowth before returning them to darkness. The path seemed longer at night, more convoluted. Twice I was certain we had taken a wrong turn, but Tamara moved with confidence. Finally, the trees opened up and we stood again at the lake's edge. Above us, the night sky blazed with more stars than I had ever seen. The Milky Way a smear of light across the darkness. Despite my earlier misgivings, I felt momentarily awestruck. We sprawled on the dock, pointing out constellations and watching for shooting stars. For a while, I forgot my unease, lost in the vastness above. Then I heard it, a splashing sound from across the lake. The splashing continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I propped myself up on my elbows, squinting into the darkness. The far shore was barely visible, a black line against the slightly less black water. "What's that noise?" I whispered, not wanting to break the night's stillness completely. At first, no one responded. Then Grace sat up beside me. Probably just a deer getting a drink. But it didn't sound like an animal lapping at water. It was more purposeful, like something stirring the lake's surface with intent. I placed my hand on Hannah's arm. "What is that?" I asked, louder this time. One by one, the others sat up, following my gaze across the water. The splashing stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. "I don't see anything," Darius said, but his voice wavered. Tamara switched on her flashlight, pointing it toward the sound's origin. The beam traveled across the water but dissipated before reaching the opposite shore. Still, in that brief illumination, I caught a glimpse of something pale against the darkness. A figure at the water's edge. "There's someone over there," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Jin fumbled for his own flashlight. When he aimed it across the lake, we all saw it clearly for the first time. A white figure was hunched at the lake's edge, impossibly thin limbs extending into the water. It wasn't moving, but somehow I knew it was aware of us, aware of our lights, our voices, our presence. "What is that?" Grace's voice had risen an octave. We watched, transfixed, as the figure slowly withdrew its elongated arms from the water. It remained crouched for several heartbeats, unmoving. Then it turned its head toward us. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes, or rather, the absence of them. Just dark hollows in a pale face. My breathing became shallow, my muscles tensing with primitive fear. The figure rose to its full height, taller than any human should be, its proportions all wrong. For one terrible moment, it simply stood there, regarding us across the water. Then it began to move. "Run," Tamara whispered. Then louder, "Run!" We scrambled off the dock, flashlight beams bouncing wildly as we searched for the path back to the cabin. Behind us, I heard splashing, violent and fast, something moving through water with unnatural speed. "This way," Grace shouted, finding the trail. We ran in a tight group, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, the splash of the creature leaving the water, followed by the sound of wet, heavy footsteps on the shore, then the cracking of undergrowth as it entered the forest behind us. A growl rose from the darkness, not the growl of any animal I'd ever heard, but something that mimicked the sound while getting it horribly wrong. The noise seemed to come from a throat not designed for such vocalizations. "It's gaining on us!" Jin cried, his voice breaking with terror. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. In the bouncing beams of our flashlights, I caught glimpses of a pale form moving through the trees with terrible efficiency, sometimes on two legs, sometimes on all fours, its body bending in ways that defied anatomy. Hannah stumbled beside me, her foot caught in a root. I grabbed her arm, yanking her forward as we continued our desperate flight. The path seemed to have lengthened impossibly, the cabin nowhere in sight. The creature's breathing grew louder. a wet, rasping sound that seemed to surround us rather than come from a single point behind. The forest floor trembled with its pursuit, dead leaves and pine needles scattering in its wake. Finally, the cabin appeared ahead, its dark windows offering the promise of sanctuary. We burst through the clearing, Tamara reaching the door first and flinging it open. We piled inside, collapsing on the floor as Darius slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. For several terrible moments, we huddled together in the darkness, our breathing ragged, listening. Outside, something circled the cabin, heavy footsteps on the porch, a scraping along the walls, the creak of weight on the roof. The windows rattled as if being tested. "What was that thing?" Hannah sobbed, her face buried against Grace's shoulder. No one answered. No one had to. We had all seen it, and none of us had words to adequately describe the wrongness of the creature, how it seemed almost human but fundamentally, horrifically not. Eventually, the sounds outside ceased. We remained frozen, afraid that any movement or noise might remind the creature of our presence. Hours passed in terrified silence, no one willing to check if it was truly gone. "We should call for help," Jin finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Grace nodded and retrieved the two-way radio her father had left. With trembling fingers, she switched it to channel 3 and pressed the talk button. "Uncle Roy, are you there? We need help. There's something outside the cabin." Static answered her. She tried again, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, anyone. We need help at Cabin 7, Evergreen Lake." More static, then a burst of sound that might have been a voice, but the words were indistinguishable. Grace adjusted the frequency, trying again and again, but we couldn't establish clear communication. "The mountains," Tamara said flatly. "They block the signal sometimes." Darius had been peering through a gap in the window curtains. "I don't see anything out there now." "It doesn't matter," I said. "We're not going outside until morning." We barricaded the door with the couch and pushed the heavy table against the most vulnerable window. Taking inventory of our supplies, we found enough water and snacks to last until Grace's father returned tomorrow. We agreed to take shifts, staying awake, 2 at a time, watching the windows and door. During my watch with Grace, sometime in the darkest part of night, she whispered, "I'm sorry I brought you here." I looked at her face, pale in the weak light of our single remaining lantern, and saw genuine remorse there. "You couldn't have known," I replied. She shook her head. "That's the thing. There were stories. Uncle Roy told my dad about hikers seeing strange things in these woods. I thought they were just trying to scare us. You know, typical adult stuff to keep kids from wandering off. But now..." A soft sound outside interrupted her, a gentle scratching at the wall beside us. We froze, holding our breath. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. When it reached the window, I saw a pale hand with too many joints press against the glass for just a moment before withdrawing. Grace gripped my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, but neither of us made a sound. Eventually, the scratching faded. "It's testing us," I whispered, looking for a way in. We woke Tamara and Darius for the next watch, but I doubt any of us truly slept that night. I lay in my bunk, every muscle tense, listening to the occasional creak of the roof or scratch at the walls, wondering if the flimsy wooden structure would be enough to keep us safe until dawn. The night stretched endlessly, each minute an exercise in terror. I found myself praying silently, bargaining with God for the sun to rise quickly, promising anything in exchange for morning light. First light arrived with excruciating slowness, a gradual lessening of darkness rather than a triumphant brightness. We gathered in the main room, pale and exhausted, no one having slept more than minutes at a time. "Should we try the radio again?" Hannah asked. Before anyone could answer, we heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching, tires on gravel, an engine rumbling. We rushed to the windows, half expecting another trick, but instead saw a Forest Service truck pulling into the clearing. Grace's Uncle Roy stepped out, looking concerned. We removed our barricade and flung open the door, tumbling out into the morning light with relief and frantic explanations. "Whoa, slow down," Roy said, holding up his hands. "What happened?" "We couldn't get a clear signal on the radio." We took turns describing our encounter, the figure across the lake, the chase through the forest, the night of terror as it circled our cabin. With each detail, Roy's expression grew more serious. "Let's take a look around," he finally said, retrieving a rifle from his truck. We followed him reluctantly to the lake, no one wanting to go but all needing confirmation of what we'd seen. In daylight, Evergreen Lake looked deceptively peaceful, its surface glassy and undisturbed. "There," I pointed to the far shore. "That's where we saw it first." Roy nodded and led us along the perimeter of the lake. As we approached the opposite shore, we discovered a trail of destruction. Vegetation crushed and torn, the muddy bank churned up with unusual indentations that couldn't quite be called footprints. "What made these?" Darius asked, his voice hushed. Roy crouched, examining the marks without touching them. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But you kids aren't the first to report seeing something strange around here." He stood, scanning the dense forest beyond the disturbed area. "About 10 years ago, there was a research facility a few miles from here. Government-funded, very secretive. Some kind of environmental science project, supposedly studying the unique ecosystem of these woods." "What happened to it?" Grace asked. "Officially, funding got cut, project abandoned. Unofficially," he hesitated. "There was an incident, some kind of containment breach. They evacuated the facility overnight, brought in hazmat teams. The whole area is still restricted." "You think whatever we saw came from there?" I asked, my mind racing with horrific possibilities. A test subject, a genetic experiment gone wrong, exposed to something that warped its body and mind. Roy shrugged. "I'm not saying that. Just telling you what I know." He pointed to the trail leading away from the lake, deeper into the forest. "Those marks head east, away from the campground. Whatever it was, it's gone now." But I wasn't convinced. As we walked back to the cabin to gather our things, Grace's father had been called and was already on his way to collect us. I felt watched. Every shadow in the trees seemed to conceal something waiting. Every rustle of leaves a potential threat. We left Evergreen Lake that afternoon, none of us speaking much during the long drive home. I told my parents we'd gotten spooked by normal forest noises, not wanting to worry them, or, worse, have them dismiss our experience entirely. In the years since, I've researched extensively, looking into government facilities in the Olympic Peninsula, unexplained disappearances in national parks, unidentified creatures sighted in the Pacific Northwest. I found nothing conclusive, just fragments and rumors, whispers of something not quite human living in those remote forests. Sometimes I wake in the night, certain I've heard scratching at my window. On those occasions, I lie perfectly still until dawn, remembering how that creature moved, with purpose and patience, hunting not from hunger, but from some darker, more deliberate motivation. I never went camping again. And whenever friends mention Evergreen Lake, I find reasons to be elsewhere. Because I know what waits there in the darkness, watching from across the water, its hollow eyes fixed on the warm lights of human habitation, biding its time. The forests of northern Minnesota conceal ancient secrets beneath layers of pine needles and winter snow. Most who venture into those woods see only the beauty, the crystalline lakes, the majestic pines, the abundant wildlife. But some of us have glimpsed what lurks beneath that serene facade, and our lives are forever altered by that knowledge. My name is Mark Peterson, former resident of Woodland, Minnesota, a place so small it barely registers on state maps. Our town was built on logging, hunting, and the stubborn resilience required to withstand the brutal northern winters. Everyone knew everyone. Gossip traveled faster than the seasonal flu, and the same families had occupied the same houses for generations. I worked as a surveyor for the county, spending most days in the vast stretches of forest surrounding our community. Those woods, particularly the dense sections of the Chippewa National Forest, were my office, my sanctuary, and eventually, the source of my nightmares. It began on a Friday night in late September at Pete's Tavern, the only drinking establishment in Woodland worth mentioning. The place smelled of decades of spilled beer, pine-scented cleaner, and the lingering ghost of cigarette smoke from before the indoor smoking ban. Mounted fish and faded photographs of triumphant hunters decorated the walls, silent witnesses to countless small-town conversations. I was nursing my second beer when Jake Thompson slid into the booth across from me. We'd been friends since elementary school, though our paths diverged after graduation. I stayed in Woodland while he attended the University of Minnesota to study history. He'd returned a few years ago to care for his ailing father and taken a job at the County Historical Society. "Mark," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper despite the din of the Friday crowd. "You ever hear about the trapper's cabin deep in the Chippewa National Forest?" I shook my head, taking another sip of my beer. Jake had always been fascinated by local legends, but there was something in his eyes that night, a feverish intensity that made me lean closer. "It's been abandoned for decades," he continued, fingers drumming nervously on the scarred wooden tabletop. "They say the trapper who built it went mad, disappeared one winter, and was never found." "Sounds like a ghost story," I laughed, but the sound fell hollow, even to my own ears. "Maybe," Jake conceded. "But there's more." He glanced around, checking who might be listening. "People who go looking for it sometimes don't come back, and those who do, well, they're never quite the same." I snorted, trying to maintain my skepticism. "Come on, Jake. How many people actually go looking for some old cabin in the middle of nowhere?" "More than you'd think," he replied, his expression dead serious. "I've been going through some old county records for work. There's a pattern, Mark. Every few years, someone goes missing in that part of the forest. Search parties find nothing. It's like they vanish into thin air." "Bears, exposure, getting lost," I countered. "There are plenty of ways to die in those woods without bringing ghosts into it." Jake shook his head and pulled a folded map from his jacket pocket, spreading it on the table. "I've triangulated the approximate location based on old survey records and reports from the few people who claim to have found it." I studied the map, recognizing the area. It was deep in the forest, several miles from any maintained trail. Remote, but not inaccessible to someone who knew the woods. Someone like me. "I've been through that area dozens of times," I said. "Never seen any cabin." "That's part of the mystery," Jake said, a glint in his eye. "People say it's hard to find unless you're specifically looking for it. Like the forest hides it somehow." I rolled my eyes. "Now you're just being dramatic." Jake folded the map and slid it across to me. "Maybe. But I thought you might be interested, considering how much time you spend out there. Keep an eye out, will you?" I pocketed the map without thinking much of it. "Sure, but don't hold your breath." We moved on to other topics. The Vikings' chances that season, local politics, mutual friends who'd moved away. By the time I left Pete's that night, the conversation about the cabin had receded to the back of my mind, just another of Jake's historical curiosities. But over the next few days, I found myself thinking about it more and more. The notion of an undiscovered cabin, hidden somewhere in my familiar woods, nagged at me. I'd look at the map during lunch breaks, studying the location Jake had marked. It wasn't far from areas I regularly surveyed. What began as idle curiosity morphed into obsession. I found myself lying awake at night, imagining what the cabin might look like, who the trapper might have been, what could have happened to him. The rational part of my brain knew it was probably nothing, an old structure long since reclaimed by the forest, if it had ever existed at all. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, sensed that Jake was right. There was something out there, waiting to be found. 2 weeks after our conversation at Pete's, I woke before dawn on my day off. The air had that particular crispness that heralds the true arrival of fall in Minnesota. I packed my rucksack methodically. Water bottles, energy bars, a compass, Jake's map, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and my hunting knife in its worn leather sheath. I didn't own a gun, never felt the need for one in our quiet town, but the weight of the knife at my hip was reassuring nonetheless. I left a note for Mrs. Gunderson, my elderly neighbor who fed my cat when I was away, saying I was going hiking and should be back by evening. Looking back, I wonder if I somehow sensed what might happen. If some part of me knew that I needed to leave a breadcrumb trail before venturing into those woods. The drive to my chosen entry point took about 40 minutes. I parked my truck at an old fire road access point, noting with satisfaction that mine was the only vehicle there. The solitude of the forest was one of its main attractions for me. I'd never been comfortable in crowds. As I locked the truck and adjusted my pack, I glanced up at the trees. They seemed to loom over me, their branches swaying slightly in the morning breeze, as if beckoning me forward. I shook off the fanciful thought and consulted my compass and Jake's map one last time. "All right," I murmured to myself. "Let's see if you're real." I set off into the woods, the fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots, unaware that I was taking my first steps toward a horror that would change my life forever. The forest welcomed me, as it always did, with a silence that wasn't truly silent at all. The soft whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant tap of a woodpecker, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. These sounds formed a natural symphony that had always brought me peace. But that morning, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The sun filtered through the canopy in the same dappled patterns. The smells of moss and decaying leaves were as rich and earthy as ever, and yet there was a tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed game trails when they aligned with my direction, bushwhacking when necessary. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as I moved deeper into the Chippewa. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I paused to check my position against Jake's map. According to his markings, the cabin should be somewhere in the vicinity, within a half-mile radius of where I stood. Taking a swig from my water bottle, I scanned the surrounding forest more carefully. The trees here were older, taller, their trunks wider than what I typically encountered. Moss grew thick on their northern sides, and the undergrowth was sparse in the deep shade they cast. I was about to continue when something caught my eye, a flash of gray among the predominant greens and browns. I moved toward it cautiously, pushing aside a curtain of hanging lichen. And there it was. The cabin stood in a small clearing, more dilapidated than I had imagined. It was built of rough-hewn logs, darkened with age and partially covered in moss. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and what remained was draped with pine needles and forest debris. A single window, its glass long gone, stared out from the front wall like an empty eye socket. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. Despite its decrepit state, there was something undeniably eerie about the structure. It seemed both a part of the forest and alien to it, something that didn't quite belong, like a splinter under the skin. "Well, I'll be damned," I muttered, surprised by how small my voice sounded in the clearing. Jake was right. I approached slowly, my boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Up close, I could see that the logs were hand-notched. the work of someone skilled with an axe. This wasn't some hunting shack thrown together for occasional use. Whoever built this had intended to stay. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, as if protesting this intrusion after years of solitude. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the gloom. The air inside was thick with the smell of rotting wood, mildew, and something else. Something musty and vaguely metallic that I couldn't identify. I let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square. Against one wall stood a crude bed frame, its mattress long since reduced to moldering rags. A stone fireplace dominated the opposite wall, its chimney partially collapsed. A rough-hewn table and chair occupied the center of the room, while shelves lined the remaining walls, still holding an assortment of rusted tools, cracked pottery, and glass jars filled with unidentifiable contents. It was a slice of history, perfectly preserved in its decay. I felt a momentary twinge of excitement, the surveyor in me appreciating this forgotten piece of the past. But that feeling was quickly overshadowed by an inexplicable sense of unease. Something about this place felt wrong, as if the very air was tainted. I moved cautiously around the small space, examining but not touching the various artifacts. Past experience had taught me to respect such finds. They belonged to the Historical Society, not in some private collection. It was then that I noticed the book on the table. Unlike everything else in the cabin, it seemed relatively well preserved. A leather-bound journal, its cover darkened with age but intact. Curiosity overcoming caution, I carefully opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible, a flowing, educated script that seemed at odds with the rustic surroundings. I gently turned to the first entry. October 3rd, 1887. I have completed the cabin at last. 3 months of labor, but I now have a proper shelter to see me through the coming winter. The location is perfect. Good trapping in all directions, a spring nearby for fresh water, and far enough from woodland that I need not suffer the company of men. After the incident in Chicago, solitude is what I require. I flipped forward through the journal, skimming entries that detailed the daily life of a trapper, successful hunts, weather observations, repairs to equipment. The writer, who never mentioned his name, seemed educated and methodical. But as winter deepened, the tone of the entries began to change. December 18th, 1887. The snow is 3 feet deep now. Haven't seen another human soul in 6 weeks, which suits me fine. But I cannot shake the feeling that I am watched. Yesterday, returning from checking the northern trap line, I observed tracks circling the cabin. Not animal tracks, but not quite human either. Too large, the stride too long. I followed them until they simply disappeared at the edge of the clearing, as if whatever made them had taken flight. December 24th, 1887. It stands at the edge of the clearing at night. I catch glimpses through the window, a tall figure, motionless among the trees. When I venture out with my rifle, it retreats, always staying just at the periphery of my vision. I've taken to keeping the fire burning all night. The entries grew more frantic as January progressed. January 16th, 1888. It speaks now. Not in words, but in sounds that might be words in a language never meant for human tongues. It comes closer each night. The locks on my door seem flimsy suddenly. My dreams are filled with visions of forests far older than these, of stone altars and sacrifices beneath moonlight. January 29th, 1888. I understand now. God help me. I understand what it wants. The hunger that can never be satisfied. The loneliness that spans centuries. It was here before the trees, before the land itself took shape. And it will be here long after. I have been chosen, though for what purpose I dare not contemplate. The final entry was dated February 4th, 1888. The handwriting had deteriorated to a barely legible scrawl. It is in the walls now, in the very logs I cut and placed with my own hands. I hear it moving in the wood at night, whispering promises of knowledge, of power. I have not slept in days. My supplies dwindle, but I cannot leave. It would follow. It would find me wherever I went. There is only one escape left to me now. The journal ended there. No explanation of what escape the writer had found. No indication of his fate. I closed the book, my hands trembling slightly. The rational part of my mind dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and the harsh winter. But another part, a deeper, more instinctual part, recognized the ring of truth in those desperate words. As if in response to my thoughts, a sound came from outside. A rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, straining to hear. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling the cabin. I set the journal down and moved cautiously to the window. The clearing appeared empty, but as I scanned the tree line, I spotted it. A figure standing motionless at the forest's edge. It was tall, unnaturally so, its proportions wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. It seemed draped in ragged clothes or perhaps matted fur, and though I couldn't make out its features clearly, I had the distinct impression it was watching me, studying me. "Hey!" I called out, more from reflex than any coherent plan. The figure didn't respond. I moved to the door, some mixture of fear and curiosity propelling me forward. As I stepped outside, the figure turned and retreated into the forest, its movements fluid yet somehow wrong, like a puppet with too many joints. My heart hammered in my chest. I briefly considered pursuing it, but quickly thought better of it. Whoever it was, I had no desire for a closer encounter. I glanced back at the cabin, suddenly eager to be away from this place. As I turned to leave, my eye caught something scratched into the log beside the door. A symbol, crude but deliberate, that resembled a stick figure with too many limbs. Below it, more recently carved, were the initials J.T. Jake Thompson. He had been here. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran down my spine. I needed to leave, now. I set off at a brisk pace, no longer concerned with following my original path, just wanting to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. The woods, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt threatening. Shadows seemed deeper, sounds more ominous. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, expecting to see that elongated figure pursuing me. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach my truck, though the journey should have been shorter. Several times I found myself disoriented, paths that should have been familiar suddenly strange and confusing. When I finally emerged from the tree line and saw my vehicle sitting where I'd left it, I nearly wept with relief. I threw my pack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and peeled out onto the fire road, gravel spraying behind me. As I drove, I glanced repeatedly in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me retreat. There was nothing there. Just the empty road and the darkening forest beyond. But somehow, that didn't make me feel any safer. I spent that night at home in a state of nervous exhaustion, jumping at every sound. My cat, Hemingway, seemed to sense my unease, staying close and watching me with his unblinking yellow eyes. I left every light in the house on and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows repeatedly. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares. I dreamed of endless forests, of being pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel at my back, its breath cold on my neck. I dreamed of the cabin, its interior vastly larger than in reality, a labyrinth of rooms filled with whispering shadows. And I dreamed of the journal's author, his face always just out of sight, writing frantically as the walls of his cabin pulsed and breathed around him. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the chill in my bedroom. The rational light of morning helped restore some semblance of equilibrium. I told myself that what I'd seen in the forest was probably just a hiker or hunter. Maybe even someone like me who'd heard the legends and gone looking for the cabin. The strange proportions, the unnatural movement. Those were tricks of the light, exaggerations born of my immersion in the trapper's paranoid scribblings. By the time I showered and made coffee, I'd almost convinced myself that the entire experience had been greatly magnified by my imagination. Almost. I decided to talk to Jake. He'd been there. His initials on the cabin wall proved that. Maybe he'd seen something similar. Maybe he could shed some light on the history of the place beyond the journal's account. I tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Not unusual for Jake. Cell service in Woodland was spotty at best. After a quick breakfast, I drove to Jake's small rental house on the edge of town. His car wasn't in the driveway, but I knocked anyway. No answer. I peered through the front window and saw nothing amiss. Just Jake's usual organized chaos of books and papers. I wasn't immediately concerned. Jake often disappeared for days at a time on research trips, especially when he was pursuing a particular historical thread. Still, I couldn't shake a vague sense of unease as I drove to the County Historical Society where he worked. Martha Olson, the elderly curator, greeted me with her usual warmth when I entered the small museum housed in what had once been Woodland's first schoolhouse. "Mark Peterson, what brings you to our humble establishment? Not often we get a visit from you unless the county's making you survey something." "Looking for Jake, actually," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "He hasn't been answering his phone." Martha's smile dimmed slightly. "Jake hasn't been in since Wednesday. Called in Thursday saying he was taking a personal day, but we haven't heard from him since. I assumed he was under the weather." Wednesday. That would have been the day after our conversation at Pete's, when he'd first told me about the cabin. A knot formed in my stomach. Did he mention anything about research he was doing? Something about an old trapper's cabin in the Chippewa? Martha tilted her head, considering. He was very interested in the disappearances over the years. Kept poring over old newspaper archives, cross-referencing them with Forest Service maps. He was convinced there was a pattern, though I told him it was probably just coincidence. The forest is dangerous for the unprepared. So he never mentioned finding anything specific? A cabin, or... "Not to me," Martha said, then hesitated. But he was excited about something last week. Said he might have found a primary source that would break the whole thing open. His words, not mine. You know how Jake gets when he's onto something. I did know. Jake's enthusiasm for historical mysteries was normally infectious, but now it sent a chill through me. "If you hear from him, could you ask him to call me right away? It's important." Martha promised she would, her expression concerned. As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Mark, be careful with this cabin business. There are places in those woods that... well, some things are better left alone." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and hurried out to my truck. My next stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dan Erickson had been a year ahead of me in school, and while we weren't close friends, we maintained the cordial relationship common in small towns. Dan was at his desk, looking harried as he sorted through paperwork. He glanced up as I entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Mark, what can I do for you?" "I'm worried about Jake Thompson," I said without preamble. "Nobody's seen him since Wednesday." Dan leaned back in his chair, which creaked protestingly. 3 days isn't exactly a missing person case, Mark. Jake's a grown man, free to come and go as he pleases. I know, but it's not like him to disappear without telling anyone. He's not answering his phone. He's not at home. He hasn't been to work. Have you checked Pete's? Or maybe he went to Minneapolis for the weekend. He's got friends at the university, right? I shook my head. Something's wrong, Dan. I can feel it. Dan studied me for a moment, then sighed. All right, what aren't you telling me? I hesitated, How much should I reveal? The story of my experience at the cabin would sound delusional, but I needed Dan to take Jake's disappearance seriously. Jake was researching something, an old trapper's cabin deep in the Chippewa. He found it recently. I went out there yesterday to see it for myself. Dan's expression shifted subtly. This cabin, it wouldn't happen to be the one folks around here call the ghost cabin, would it? I blinked in surprise. You know about it? Every sheriff in Woodland County for the last 100 years has known about it, Dan said, his voice low despite the empty office. It's part of the unofficial briefing when you take the badge. Most dismiss it as local superstition, but... But what, Dan? He stood abruptly and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner. After rummaging through several drawers, he extracted a manila folder and placed it on his desk. This is my personal file. Not official department records, just things I've noticed over the years. I opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photocopies of older documents, all related to disappearances in the Chippewa National Forest. Some dated back to the early 1900s. 27 people, Dan said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how many have vanished in that specific area of the Chippewa since records began. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no explanations. Just gone. I flipped through the documents, a chill creeping up my spine. The disappearances occurred in clusters, 3 or 4 over the span of a few months, followed by years of nothing. The most recent had been in 2018, a family of hikers who'd vanished without a trace. Why isn't this common knowledge? I asked. Why aren't there warnings, closures of the area? Dan ran a hand through his thinning hair. Politics, tourism, the rational explanations, bears, exposure, people getting lost, are easier for folks to accept. And honestly, until you mentioned the cabin, I'd never made the connection myself. It's just, that part of the forest has always had a bad reputation. I showed him Jake's map with the cabin's location marked. Dan studied it, his face grim. I'll put out an APB on Jake's vehicle and send a deputy out to do a proper welfare check at his place. But Mark? His eyes met mine. Stay away from that cabin. If Jake wandered out there alone... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I left the sheriff's office with a promise to call if I heard from Jake. But as I drove home, I knew I wouldn't be staying away from the cabin. Whatever was happening, Jake was mixed up in it, and I couldn't just abandon my friend. The next day was Sunday. I spent it calling everyone who might have seen Jake, mutual friends, his co-workers, even his ex-girlfriend in Minneapolis. No one had heard from him. By evening, my concern had transformed into near panic. I couldn't shake the image of that figure at the forest's edge, nor the final, desperate words in the trapper's journal. Monday morning brought news, but not the kind I'd hoped for. Dan called early, his voice tight with stress. "We found Jake's car," he said without preamble. "It was parked at the same access point you used, according to the map you showed me. We've organized a search party. I think you should join us. You know those woods better than most." I agreed immediately and was at the meeting point within the hour. The search team consisted of Dan, 2 deputies, 4 volunteer firefighters, and me. We spread out in a standard search pattern, working our way toward the area where the cabin was located. The forest felt different that day, oppressive, unwelcoming. The usual sounds seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Despite the chill in the air, I found myself sweating as we methodically covered ground. Hours passed with no sign of Jake or anyone else. We called his name until our voices grew hoarse, the sound swallowed by the dense vegetation. As afternoon waned, Dan made the decision to suspend the search until morning. "We'll lose the light soon," he explained, frustration evident in his tight expression. "Resume at first light with more volunteers and the state's cadaver dogs." The word cadaver hit me like a physical blow. Until that moment, I'd been operating under the desperate belief that Jake was just lost, maybe injured, but alive. Now, I was forced to confront the possibility that we might be searching for a body. That night, unable to sleep, I pored over the documents Dan had allowed me to copy. The pattern of disappearances was eerier than he'd let on. They occurred in roughly 20-year cycles, with the most recent cluster starting in 2018. If the pattern held, more people would vanish this year. The most disturbing document was a statement from a forest ranger dated 1956. He claimed to have found the cabin during a routine patrol and spent the night there when a sudden storm hit. In his statement, he described movements in the walls and whispering that came from everywhere and nowhere. He'd fled at first light, becoming disoriented in familiar territory. When he finally made it back to his station, 3 days had passed, though he insisted he'd only been gone overnight. The ranger quit his job a week later and moved out of state. I woke the next morning gritty-eyed but determined. The expanded search team gathered at dawn, nearly 30 people now, including volunteers from neighboring towns and a K-9 unit with experienced handlers. Dan gave instructions, emphasizing safety and communication protocols. We were to maintain radio contact at all times and report anything unusual immediately. The day passed in a blur of crashing through underbrush, calling Jake's name, and checking increasingly unlikely locations. By mid-afternoon, morale was flagging. The dogs had found no scent. The search of Jake's house and computer had revealed nothing helpful, and even the most optimistic among us were beginning to lose hope. That's when the radio crackled with the voice of Bill Hawkins, one of the volunteer firefighters. "I've found something," he said, his voice tinny through the small speaker. "About 2 miles northeast of base camp. Looks like a cabin. Old one." My blood ran cold. I glanced at Dan, who was already consulting his map. "That's nowhere near where it should be," I said, pointing to the location Jake had marked. "The cabin's here, not there." Dan's expression was grim. "Stay put, Bill. We're coming to you." It took us 20 minutes to reach Bill's position, my mind racing the entire time. How could the cabin have moved? It wasn't possible. Yet as we approached the clearing Bill had described, there it was. The same dilapidated structure I'd visited days earlier, logs darkened with age, roof partially collapsed. "That's it," I whispered to Dan. "That's the cabin. But it's not where it's supposed to be." Dan's hand moved to the gun at his hip, a reflexive gesture. "Let's check it out. Everyone else, secure the perimeter." We approached cautiously, the fallen leaves silent beneath our feet. The door hung askew just as before, but something was different. A smell emanating from inside, copper-sharp and unmistakable. Blood. Dan drew his weapon. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice professional but tight. He pushed the door open with his foot, gun raised. The smell intensified, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw why. The interior walls of the cabin were smeared with blood. Not random splatters, but deliberate patterns. Symbols similar to the one I'd seen carved by the door, but more elaborate, more numerous. The crude table still stood in the center of the room, but now something lay upon it. Something covered with a stained canvas tarp. Dan moved forward, his training overriding the horror that had frozen me in place. With one hand, he lifted a corner of the tarp. I caught only a glimpse of what lay beneath before my mind rejected the image. Matted hair, flesh torn in long, parallel strips, exposed bone gleaming wetly in the dim light. But it was enough to recognize the plaid shirt, now sodden with dark fluid. Jake. I staggered backward, a scream building in my throat. Dan dropped the tarp and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "Out! Everyone out now!" He shouted into his radio, his voice breaking with urgency. We stumbled into the clearing where the search team had gathered. Dan was shouting orders, calling for backup, evidence techs, the county coroner, but his words seemed to come from far away. My ears were filled with a rushing sound, like wind through trees, though the air was perfectly still. And then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden among the ancient pines, stood the figure. In daylight, its wrongness was even more apparent. Limbs too long and jointed in impossible places, its head cocked at an angle that would snap a human neck. It wore what looked like rags or perhaps strips of bark, and though I still couldn't make out its features clearly, I felt its gaze fixed on me. "Dan," I croaked, pointing with a trembling hand. He spun, gun raised, but his expression showed only confusion. "What? What is it?" "There," I insisted. "Right there at the tree line." Dan squinted in the direction I was pointing. "I don't see anything, Mark." But others had noticed my distress. Bill stepped forward, following my gaze, and his face drained of color. "Holy Mother of God," he whispered. One by one, members of the search party spotted the figure. Some backed away in terror, others froze in place. A woman began to pray in rapid, desperate Spanish. The figure took a step forward, emerging partially from the tree line. In that moment, I understood what the trapper had written about. The ancient hunger. The patient malevolence that had existed before the forest itself. This wasn't a ghost or a monster in any conventional sense. It was something far worse. Something for which our language had no name. Dan finally saw it. His gun wavered in his hand. "What the hell is that thing?" he breathed. Before anyone could answer, the figure moved. Not toward us, but sideways, circling the clearing with that fluid yet wrong motion. As it moved, the light seemed to bend around it, distorting my perception. For a moment, I thought I saw not one figure, but many, overlapping like multiple exposures in a photograph. Then the world twisted. The only way I can describe it is to say that reality itself seemed to fold inward. The trees, the sky, the very air rippled like the surface of a pond. I felt a pressure in my ears, a sensation of falling though my feet remained planted on solid ground. When the disorientation passed, the figure was gone, and so were 3 members of our search party. Chaos erupted in the clearing. People shouted names, counted heads, tried desperately to make sense of what had just happened. Bill Hawkins and 2 others, Elena Rodriguez and Mike Denton, had simply vanished. There one moment and gone the next. Dan tried to maintain order, but I could see the shock in his eyes, the fundamental disbelief as his understanding of the world crumbled around him. This wasn't something that could be solved with police procedure or rational investigation. We had stepped into territory beyond human comprehension. The cabin, when we turned back to it, was empty. No blood-smeared walls, no covered shape on the table. No sign that Jake or anyone else had ever been there. Just dust and abandonment, exactly as I'd first found it. The search devolved into a retreat. Dan called in the disappearances, careful to omit any mention of what we'd seen. No one would believe us anyway. The official report would cite an animal attack, perhaps a bear, and dangerous terrain conditions. The families would never know the truth. In the days that followed, Woodland changed. Fear settled over the town like a shroud. People spoke in hushed tones about the missing search party members, about Jake, about the forest itself. Children were kept indoors. The local hiking club suspended all activities indefinitely. I withdrew into myself, haunted by what I'd seen, and unable to share the full horror with anyone. Dan stopped by occasionally, his face increasingly haggard as the fruitless investigation continued. We would sit in silence, both understanding that conventional methods were useless against what we faced. A week after the search, I woke in the middle of the night to find Hemingway bristling at my bedroom window, his back arched, a low growl in his throat. Outside, the yard was bathed in pale moonlight. and at the edge of the tree line that marked the beginning of the forest behind my house, a familiar elongated silhouette stood watching. I didn't sleep again that night, or many nights after. The figure began appearing regularly at my window, reflected in my computer screen, glimpsed from the corner of my eye while driving. Always watching, always just out of clear view. I began to understand the trapper's descent into paranoia. Reality itself seemed thin, permeable, with something ancient and hungry pressing against it from the other side. My work suffered. I made errors in my surveys, forgot appointments, snapped at colleagues. Eventually, I took a leave of absence, citing personal reasons. Alone in my house, I devoted myself to understanding what we faced. I spread Dan's documents across my dining room table, added printouts of my own research, and began looking for patterns beyond the obvious cycle of disappearances. I created a timeline, marking not just when people vanished, but other unusual occurrences in the area. Unexplained animal deaths, reports of strange lights or sounds, even significant weather anomalies. A pattern emerged, one that aligned with astronomical events. The disappearances clustered around specific celestial alignments that occurred every 20 years or so. The next such alignment was less than a month away. Armed with this revelation, I returned to the Historical Society, now operating under interim management since Jake's disappearance. I spent days in their archives, piecing together the history of the area before white settlement. What I found disturbed me deeply. The indigenous Ojibwe people had avoided that particular section of forest for centuries. Their oral histories spoke of a thin place, where the barrier between worlds weakened, allowing passage of entities they called the Long Walkers, or those who stand between trees. The stories described rituals once performed to keep these entities at bay, rituals abandoned after European missionaries arrived. I took my findings to Dan, who listened with the weary acceptance of a man who had seen too much to dismiss anything outright. So what are you saying? That this thing, whatever it is, has been taking people for centuries? And it's going to take more when this alignment happens? I think it's been doing this since before humans arrived here, I said, my voice hoarse from too little sleep and too much coffee. And yes, I believe it's building towards something. The disappearances are accelerating. First Jake, then 3 search party members. The pattern suggests it needs, I don't know, a certain number before the alignment. Needs them for what? Dan asked, though his expression suggested he didn't really want to know. The journal said something about hunger, about loneliness spanning centuries. I think it feeds somehow, not on bodies, but on something else. Fear, maybe, or some essential human quality we don't have words for. Dan was silent for a long moment, staring at the papers spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hollow with fatigue. What do we do, Mark? How do we fight something like this? I had been asking myself the same question for days. The answer had come to me in fragments, pieces of a terrible puzzle that I'd been reluctant to assemble. We can't fight it. Not directly, but the Ojibwe knew how to contain it, how to strengthen the boundary between worlds. If we could recreate their ritual. And how exactly do we do that? It's not like we can look it up on Google. No, I agreed. But there might be records at the University of Minnesota's anthropology department. And there's one other source. What's that? I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. The cabin itself. The trapper's journal mentioned understanding at the end. I think he learned something. Something that's still there in the cabin, if we know how to look for it. Dan shook his head. You want to go back there? After what happened? I don't see another option. More people will disappear if we do nothing. And next time, it could be anyone. You. Me. Someone from town who just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The thought hung between us, heavy with implication. Finally, Dan nodded. I can't officially sanction this. You understand that, right? As far as the department is concerned, we've got animal attacks and people getting lost in rough terrain. I understand. But unofficially, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small object, a tarnished silver key. This was found among Jake's personal effects. We don't know what it opens, but given where he was researching, I took the key, its metal cold against my palm. It was old, ornate, the kind that might open an antique cabinet or chest. Thank you, I said, pocketing it. Don't thank me, Dan replied grimly. Just be careful. And Mark, don't go alone. But as I left his office, I knew that's exactly what I would do. I couldn't risk anyone else's life in this endeavor. The weight of Jake's death, of the missing search party members, already pressed down on me like a physical burden. I couldn't add to it. That night, I prepared. I packed a backpack with essentials, food, water, a first aid kit, extra batteries for my flashlight. After some consideration, I added items that might have ritual significance based on my research. Sage bundles, a silver knife purchased from an antique store, chalk for drawing protective symbols. As I worked, I felt the presence watching me from outside my window. When I turned to look, I saw not just one figure, but several, their elongated forms silhouetted against the night sky. They were gathering, preparing for their harvest. I slept fitfully, waking often to check that my doors and windows remained secure. In my dreams, I walked through endless forests where the trees whispered with human voices and the ground pulsed beneath my feet like a living heart. Morning came with a sense of grim determination. I loaded my truck before dawn, pausing only to leave food and water for Hemingway and a note for Mrs. Gunderson explaining that I'd be gone for a few days on work business. A lie, but a necessary one. The drive to the forest was tensely quiet. No radio, no passing traffic, just the sound of my own breathing and the steady hum of tires on asphalt. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, which suited my mood. I parked at a different access point than before, one farther from where Jake's car had been found. It meant a longer hike to the cabin's presumed location, but it also meant I was less likely to be followed or interrupted. As I stepped into the forest, I felt its awareness settle over me like a physical weight. The trees seemed to lean inward, watching my progress. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on fallen leaves. I consulted my compass regularly, though I knew the cabin might not be where I expected. It seemed to shift location, appearing where it was needed, or where it could feed. Still, I had to start somewhere, and Jake's original map coordinates were my best guess. Hours passed as I hiked deeper into the Chippewa. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Fallen trees blocking the path, sudden ravines requiring careful navigation, thorny underbrush that tore at my clothing. It felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was trying to impede my progress. By mid-afternoon, I should have reached the clearing according to my calculations. Instead, I found myself in an unfamiliar section of forest where the trees grew unnaturally close together, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes as if they had grown around some invisible obstacle. That's when I noticed the markings. At first, I thought they were natural formations in the bark, perhaps the result of disease or insect damage. But as I looked closer, I saw that they formed distinct patterns, the same symbols I'd seen smeared in blood on the cabin walls during the search. I traced one with my finger, feeling its grooves beneath my skin. The marking seemed to pulse with warmth, though the wood around it remained cool to the touch. As I studied it, the forest around me shifted subtly, the quality of light changing, shadows deepening, the very air growing thicker, and I understood. The symbols weren't just markings, they were a language, a code inscribed into the very fabric of the forest. The cabin wasn't a fixed structure, but a nexus, a point where reality thinned, and these symbols were the key to finding it. I began walking again, this time looking for the markings rather than following my compass. They appeared with increasing frequency, carved into trees, etched into stones, even formed by the pattern of fallen branches on the ground. Each one I touched altered my perception slightly, guiding me toward what I sought. As twilight approached, I emerged into a small clearing dominated by an enormous oak tree. Its trunk was wider than my outstretched arms could encompass, its branches reaching skyward like supplicating hands. And nestled among its roots, half buried in the earth, was a weathered wooden door. Not the cabin I'd expected, but something more primal, more integrated with the forest itself. The trapper's original structure had perhaps been built around this entrance, this portal to whatever lay beyond our world. I approached cautiously, my hand moving to the silver key in my pocket. The door had no visible lock, no handle, just weathered wood bound with rusted iron bands. Yet when I pressed my palm against it, I felt a sensation like a key turning in a lock, though no physical mechanism moved. The door swung inward silently, revealing not a room but a passage, earthen steps leading down into darkness. The smell that wafted up was ancient and musty, reminiscent of peat bogs and buried things. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming for retreat. But the image of Jake's mutilated body, of the missing search party members, of the figures gathering outside my window, drove me forward. I switched on my flashlight and began my descent into the heart of the mystery. The stairs descended far deeper than seemed possible, spiraling downward in a tight helix that made me increasingly disoriented. The earthen walls gave way to stone, smooth and featureless except for occasional markings similar to those I'd followed through the forest. My flashlight beam seemed inadequate against the profound darkness, illuminating only a few steps ahead at a time. The air grew colder, damper, carrying that same ancient smell of decay and something else. A subtle musk that reminded me of the figure I'd seen watching from the tree line. After what felt like hours of descent, I reached the bottom. My flashlight revealed a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness, its walls curving away into shadow. The floor was smooth stone, worn by countless feet over untold centuries. And at the center of the chamber stood the cabin. Not as I'd seen it before, dilapidated and weathered, but intact, pristine, as it must have appeared when newly built. Its logs gleamed with fresh-cut sap, its roof tightly shingled, its door and windows perfectly aligned. It looked bizarrely out of place in this subterranean setting, like a stage prop placed in the wrong scene. I approached warily, aware of movement in the periphery of my vision, shadowy forms that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me from all sides. The cabin door bore a proper lock this time, an antique keyhole that matched the tarnished key Dan had given me. With trembling fingers, I inserted it and turned. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung inward smoothly. The interior was exactly as I'd seen it on my first visit, before the blood and horror of the search. A crude bed, a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chair, shelves lined with tools and jars. But now those jars gleamed with an inner light, each containing what appeared to be fireflies or some luminescent substance that cast the room in a pale blue glow. On the table lay the journal, open to a page I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was the same flowing script, but the language was unlike anything I recognized. Not English or any European tongue, but something older, its characters resembling the symbols carved into the trees. As I stared at the pages, the incomprehensible text began to shift, rearranging itself before my eyes, until it formed words I could understand. They were here before us. They will be here after. The long walkers, the watchers between trees. Not gods, not demons, but hungry. always hungry for what we possess, and they do not. The spark of life, the warmth of soul, the capacity for joy and grief and love. They feed on these, drawing them out slowly, savoring the fear and confusion of those they take. I have learned their ways, learned to speak their tongue, to write their signs. They believe I will join them willingly, become their voice, their lure to draw others. They are powerful beyond measure, but they do not understand human resilience, human capacity for sacrifice. There is a binding that can be performed, a sealing of the thin places where they cross between worlds. It requires blood freely given, life willingly surrendered. One soul to save many. The Ojibwe knew this. Their shamans performed the ritual every generation until the old ways were forgotten. I will make this sacrifice. I will use their hunger against them, drawing them close, binding them with my final breath. The cabin is the key, built on their crossing point, its very structure a cage if the proper words are spoken, the proper signs drawn. To any who find this record, the binding weakens with time. If you read these words, the 20-year cycle has begun again. The hunger grows. They will come in greater numbers, take more souls, until the thin place tears open completely and they pour through in a flood. You have a choice, as I did. Flee and live out your days in fear, knowing what comes for you in the darkness. Or make the sacrifice, renew the binding, and grant another 20 years of safety to those you leave behind. The words are written in your heart. The signs are carved in your bones. You need only speak, only draw, only offer what they crave most. Willing surrender. The text shifted again, becoming incomprehensible symbols once more. But I understood now. The trapper hadn't gone mad from isolation. He'd discovered the truth and made the ultimate sacrifice to protect others. Jake had found the same truth and likely intended the same sacrifice before he was taken, his discovery of the key suggesting he'd been here, in this underground chamber. A sound behind me, a soft, deliberate footstep. I spun, flashlight raised. The figure stood in the doorway, no longer half glimpsed or shadowed, but fully revealed in the pale blue light. It was as tall as the cabin's ceiling, its limbs impossibly elongated, joints bending in directions human anatomy wouldn't allow. Its skin was not skin at all, but a mosaic of what looked like tree bark, lichen, and something wet and glistening that pulsed with each movement. Its face was the worst part, a suggestion of human features stretched and distorted across a misshapen skull, eyes too large and entirely black, mouth a lipless gash that opened to reveal not teeth but small, writhing appendages like pale fingers. Behind it, I could see more figures gathering in the chamber outside the cabin. 5, 10, 20 of them. Their forms slightly varying, but all sharing that same wrong quality, that same ancient hunger in their bottomless eyes. The long walkers, the watchers between trees, coming for their harvest. The figure in the doorway tilted its head at an impossible angle, studying me. When it spoke, the sound came not from its mouth, but from the very air around me. A susurration of whispers that somehow formed words. You have come. As the writer came. As the searcher came. You have brought what we need. Jake, I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. The others from the search party. Where are they? The figure's mouth stretched in what might have been a smile. Here. Part of us now. Their warmth sustains us. Their memories entertain us. Their souls illuminate our darkness. It extended one elongated arm, fingers unnaturally jointed and tipped with what looked like thorns. Join them. Give yourself willingly. The hunger grows. The time approaches. The thin place weakens. I backed away until I hit the table, the journal pressing against my lower back. The trapper's words echoed in my mind. One soul to save many. The cabin is the key. I understood now why I'd been drawn here, why I'd been allowed to find this place when others had simply vanished. They wanted me to make the choice, to give myself willingly. The sacrifice was more potent that way, the binding stronger. Jake must have known, must have intended to perform the ritual himself before they took him. Was that why his body had been left for us to find, mutilated but identifiable? A message, a warning, a call to action? The figure took another step into the cabin, its companions pressing closer behind it. I could feel their collective hunger like a physical force pulling at something deep within me. Decide, the whisper voice commanded. Join or flee. But know that if you flee, we will follow. We will take others, many others. When the thin place tears, your town, your people, all will feed our hunger. I thought of Woodland, of Dan, of Mrs. Gunderson and Hemingway, of all the people who had no idea what lurked in the forest at their doorstep. I thought of Jake and the others already taken, their essence feeding these ancient, patient predators. And I knew what I had to do. If I agree, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. If I give myself willingly, you'll be bound again? The town will be safe for another 20 years? The figure's head tilted further, almost upside down now. The binding requires willing sacrifice, blood freely given, life surrendered with purpose. That's not an answer. It is the only answer we can give. The binding is not our choice. It is the law of the thin places, older than your kind, older than the trees themselves. I considered my options. I could try to flee, though I doubted I'd make it past the gathered figures outside. Even if I did, what then? Return to town with a story no one would believe. Watch as people continued to disappear, knowing the harvest would only escalate as the celestial alignment approached. Or I could make the sacrifice, as the trapper had, as Jake had intended to. 20 years of safety for Woodland. 20 years before someone else would have to make this same terrible choice. It wasn't really a choice at all. I'll do it, I said. But I need to know how. The journal mentioned words, signs. The figure's mouth stretched wider, those writhing appendages reaching outward like eager tongues. You know already. The knowing is in your blood now, pressed into you by this place, by our presence. And strangely, I did know. Words in that ancient language formed in my mind. Symbols appeared behind my eyelids when I blinked. I reached for my backpack and withdrew the silver knife I'd brought, its blade catching the pale blue light. Will it hurt? I asked, a final human concern in the face of the incomprehensible. The figure made a sound like rustling leaves, which I somehow recognized as laughter. Yes, and no. The taking is painful. The becoming is not. You will be part of us. You will watch from the trees. You will know our hunger and our patience. Not exactly a comforting thought, but it was too late for comfort now. I turned to the blank wall behind me and began carving the symbols that burned in my mind. Complex, interconnected patterns that seemed to shift and move as I created them. The figures watched in silence, their hunger momentarily held in check by curiosity or perhaps ritual obligation. When the last symbol was complete, I turned back to face them, knife in hand. I, Mark Peterson, give myself willingly, I said, the alien words flowing from my lips as if I'd spoken them all my life. Blood freely given, life surrendered with purpose. I bind you to this thin place for 20 cycles of your hunger. I cage you within the boundaries of this forest. I drew the knife across my palm, deeper than intended, blood welling up immediately. The figures surged forward as one, that collective hunger becoming almost overwhelming in its intensity. I pressed my bleeding hand against the symbols I'd carved, smearing them with blood that seemed to sizzle and glow as it touched the wood. The cabin around me began to vibrate, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat. The lead figure reached me first, its thorn-tipped fingers piercing my chest without resistance, as if my flesh offered no more barrier than mist. The pain was excruciating but brief, a moment of searing agony followed by a spreading coldness. I felt myself being pulled apart, not physically, but essentially. Memories, emotions, the very core of my being drawn out and absorbed. Images flashed before my eyes. Childhood summers in woodland, my parents' faces, college years, my first surveying job, Jake laughing at Pete's tavern, the forest in all seasons, Hemingway purring on my lap. The coldness reached my heart, and with my last human thought, I wondered if anyone would find my truck, if Dan would piece together what had happened, if 20 years from now someone else would stand where I stood and make the same choice. Then humanity fell away, and I became something else. Part of the ancient consciousness that dwelled between worlds, bound by sacrifice but patient, so patient. I could feel the others who had been taken, their essences still distinct. Though changed, Jake was there, and Bill, Elena, Mike, and dozens more going back centuries, including the trapper whose name, I now knew, was William Corbin. The binding took hold, the symbols glowing with power, the cabin's structure becoming a cage once more. The hunger would remain, but it would be contained, controlled, limited to the occasional unfortunate who strayed too deep into the forest. For 20 years, until the next alignment, when the thin place would weaken again and the cycle would repeat. As consciousness faded into that collective otherness, my last distinct thought was of the forest I had loved, now my eternal prison and home. I would watch from the trees, a shadow at the periphery of human vision, a figure glimpsed but never clearly seen, a long walker, a watcher between trees, waiting, hungry, patient, for 20 years.